So very welcome again. I'm delighted to have our visiting speaker here today. He's an old friend of mine, Dr. Jay Roszman, who is a lecturer in Irish history at University College Cork. Jay is coming back to Queen's after quite a long while away. He did the Irish Studies MA here back in the day before going back to the States to do his PhD at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh under the supervision of David Miller. And his dissertation began as a project a project looking at the characteristics of agrarian violence in pre-famine Ireland, which evolved into a story about the relationship between violence and the British state immediately preceding the famine. The dissertation earned the Adele Delsimer Prize from the American Conference of Irish Studies in 20. Jay came back to Ireland to take up the post in Irish history at UCC in 2018. His first monograph, Outrage in the Age of Reform, Irish Agrarian Violence, Imperial Insecurity, and British Governing Policy 1830 to 1845, has just been published by Cambridge University Press. And it re-examines the so-called Decade of Reform, demonstrating how Ireland, especially Irish agrarian violence, shaped British political culture in previously unappreciated ways. And his next project will explore the relationship between the British Empire and the constituent Queen's Colleges from 1845 to 1921. But it's on the monograph project that Jay's going to talk to us this afternoon. And as you can see from the title there of the slides, the topic of today's talk is the Irish face of British politics, Irish agrarian violence, ultra-Tories, and the end of Whig government, 1835 to 1841. So Jay, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for coming out today, especially to Peter, of course, and the Institute of Irish Studies for having me. As Peter mentioned, I earned my MA in Irish Studies here in 2007 as a naive 22-year-old American. And I have very fond memories of attending this seminar during that time, trying to follow along with presentations, impress the PhD students and lecturers in attendance with my presence. And I think I've mentioned this to Peter once before, but I also have very fond memories of once besting Peter, I think Robert Blythe and maybe Andrew Holmes, although I can't quite remember, in a pub quiz. And just as the pub is no longer there, I think it was down on Lower Crescent. I'm sure Peter has wiped this defeat from his memory. But in short, coming to Belfast always really brings back the fondest of memories for me. And I consider it an honor to present a bit of my research here, considering just how formative my time at Queen's proved to be in my journey in Irish history. So my talk today, The Irish Face of British Politics, is drawing on material from my recent book, Outrage in the Age of Reform. And to rather give away the ending, my book at its heart is making a very simple claim, that if you want to understand the history of the United Kingdom or its politics, ignore Ireland's place within it at your peril. The book is an extended case study showing how important what happens in Ireland is to understanding the trajectory of British politics in the 1830s, which naturally has important echoes across the 19th century and into the politics of the present. But that's not where the project started. And as I look back, it's interesting, at least to me, to think about how it's changed over something I think most historians, of course, are intimately familiar with, but maybe a useful point to start with for postgraduate students or others laboring at the coalface of the archives and wondering where their project is going. So this project began, So this project began when my late dissertation advisor, David W. Miller, handed me a box of microfilm of material he had collected in the 1990s for a project on collective action with the historical sociologist Charles Tilley that never came to fruition. I had told David I was quite interested in agrarian violence, and this microfilm was a complete copy of so-called Reports of Outrage, a daily correspondence from Dublin Castle to the Home Office in Whitehall, listing every single agrarian act of agrarian violence in the later 1830s, and to a point I'll come back to in a moment. So I began my project really interested in agrarian violence. As impressed as I was with reading the rich and deep historiography of agrarian violence in the Irish countryside, I felt that too often it skewed to periods of profound violence, with the White Boys, the Hearts of Steel, the Hearts of Oak, the Rockites, etc. And I wondered what, if any, characteristics were manifest during so-called normal times, when no regional movement of violence was underway. So to analyze that question, I explored agrarian violence in one particular year, 1838, drawn from David's microfilm, and then a case study approach of 4 counties of outrage papers in the National Archives in Dublin. However, exploring the qualitative and quantitative characteristic of outrages, I quickly became confronted by the way that fed into larger political questions. I became fascinated by the way that Whig politicians, to use Peter Mandler's taxonomy, so-called Foxites, approached governing Ireland in new ways in the later part of the 1830s. Embodied in their mantra of justice to Ireland, the Home Secretary Lord John Russell, Lord Mulgrave as Lord Lieutenant, and Lord Morpeth as Chief Secretary, attempted to rectify Irish Catholic grievances using a variety of tactics, including executive appointments and attempts at legislative reform. I felt this had received rather short shrift in much of the historiography on the decade of reform, partly because it failed, and partly because of some historians' reticence or unwillingness to integrate Ireland into analysis of British political culture, notwithstanding someone seated right next to me. I'll add that it didn't help that many Irish historians treated this period as a sort of lull between the 2 landmarks guiding their treatment of O'Connell's career in emancipation and reform. Indeed, if you look at the most recent biography of O'Connell from Patrick Geoghegan, he literally calls 1840 and the return to repeal O'Connell's resurrection, implying that there was this death in the 1830s in his political organizing. Nevertheless, the more I read, the more convinced I became that the Whig approach to Ireland in the later 1830s was fundamentally different than what came before it, and that this was made possible by a parliamentary embrace with O'Connell, who himself was eager to deliver political change. The relationship between O'Connell and the Whigs brought me to one final realization, which animates the bulk of my talk today. Historians branded the 1830s as the decade of reform for good reason, both because of the political consequences launched by the Great Reform Act of 1832, as well as an acknowledgement of the philosophical discourse driving governing policy. Although by no means a slogan used exclusively by Whigs and radicals, the term's association with the Whig Party underscores the salient fact that the 1830s was dominated by Whig government and a concerted effort by government officials to modernize and centralize state apparatuses. The label of reform gave coherence to this period and provided an explanation for Britain's divergence down constitutional democratic paths, while the continent descended into revolution and autocracy. Historians obviously have provided much more nuance to this very simplistic rendering, especially those highlighting Whig failure and the party's eventual collapse, but the reform label has endured. An effect of segregating Ireland from one's analysis of the overall trends of governing policy in the 1830s has been to limit the scope of our understanding the project of reform and one of the primary venues for its implementation, Ireland's. But another significant problem arises when treating Ireland separately from the rest of Great Britain in this period. Without an Irish dimension, the story around the Tory party's return to power in 1841 is simply incomplete. In particular, it fails to account for the ways the reactionary wing of the Conservative Party, the Ultras, recovering from the dizzying effects of reform, effectively organized a campaign to undermine Whig narratives of progress and used Ireland and all its complications and outrages as a mean to stir anti-Catholic, anti-Irish sentiments amongst the British electorate. Ultra-Tories publicly lamented the death of Protestant ascendancy in Ireland as a result of Catholic emancipation, and suggested that Whig governing policy was a harbinger of the undermining of the Protestant nature of the British Empire. Furthermore, Tories politicized the endemic violence of Ireland's countryside as a way to undermine Whig narratives of justice to Ireland, and to suggest a relationship to potential violence across the empire. In this Tory rendering, therefore, the deplorable state of the Irish countryside and the corresponding rise of Catholic influence was an obvious government would do to the wider empire and British dominance in the world. So, first then, I want to establish what politicians perceived to be the problem. By the 1830s, politicians from all political backgrounds had identified or the so-called state of the country as one of the main hindrances in Irish social, economic, and political development. I've argued elsewhere that these outrages, as they were called, were understood as a countervailing and contested sovereignty attempting to supplant the functions of the state. Irish peasants' actions, therefore, were interpreted as disloyalty to the British Crown, as insurrection, or as a potential threat of war. To deal with the subversive threat posed by agrarian violence, the Whig government used the newly reformed Irish Constabulary to monitor, categorize, and tabulate agrarian violence in quantifiable forms. Okay. So beginning in 1837, constables filled out so-called outrage reports, Form 38, to surveil all forms of agrarian violence they deemed dangerous. Form 38, sent directly to Dublin Castle by the constable, included a number of important fields to input. The constables noted the county, the barony, and the parish where the offense was committed, the distance to the nearest police station, and the last time authorities patrolled the area, along with who reported the outrage to police. Deemed a reward necessary, he noted the amount at the top right of the form, distinguishing between private information given to him and information sworn in. Then the form was columns, and on the left-hand side, the reporting officer noted his statement, which the instructions at the bottom of the form required to, quote, give a clear statement of the occurrence, mentioning the day of the month, the hour when perpetrated, whether the constable had visited the scene of outrage and made personal inquiries, and, quote, what steps have been taken to discover to make them amenable, along with an accurate description of those responsible if they had absconded. On the right-hand side of the form, officials at Dublin Castle would make no and convey any plan for action or admonishment to the officers that filled in the form. So there's a lot of complaining in the archives, for example, about poor penmanship, which was a serious. Many examples in the outrage papers stress the importance of uniformity and precision to give the Irish government a true picture of Irish outrage at any moment. I want to make sure I have everything up here. And just the last point here is on the right-hand side, they would also categorize outrages into a particular taxonomy, which I can discuss more. These forms were then summarized and sent on to Whitehall for review by the Home Secretary. And this is the bulk of my archival or my microfilm material, which was a daily correspondence where every day Lord John Russell at Whitehall would get a cover sheet with every single outrage across each county and then a short description of what happened in those events. In short, accuracy and consistency in reporting meant that data could be compiled and to draw state of Irish society. In essence, criminal statistics offered a pulse on the vitality of the Union and the relative success or failure of a party's government. Agrarian violence, therefore, became the fodder for political battle. The statistical data from the outrage reports was open to interpretation. The numbers that Whig used to demonstrate how crime had fallen, how their policy of justice to Ireland had improved the countryside, were often challenged with different numbers used by Tories to highlight the inability of the Whigs to crush agrarian violence. I'm happy to talk more about the use of these statistics by both sides, but I now want to turn our attention to the rise of ultra-Tories and their use of Irish outrages as a tool to recapture government benches. This discussion will include some scenic along the way. Okay, so by the time of Lord Grey's ascension to government benches in November 1830, many Protestants connected with Ireland had witnessed what they believed to be their greatest betrayal, the passage of Catholic emancipation by their own party. The run-up to Catholic emancipation, however, had begun the important process of mobilizing Protestant popular opinion against Catholic inclusion with the creation of Protestant clubs, or the so-called Brunswick Constitutional Clubs. Even though these efforts proved unsuccessful in stopping emancipation's passage, they did demonstrate the latent level of anti-Catholic sentiment in Britain and the importance of Ireland as a focal point for contention. As the historian John Wolfe has noted in his study of anti-Catholicism, Protestant ascendancy in Ireland had been, quote, part of the sacrosanct constitutional order defining a Protestant empire extending across the Irish Sea. The failure to stop Catholic emancipation stirred ultra-Tories into political action, both at elite and popular levels. To counter British perceptions of the Irish gentry's general fecklessness, Anglo-Irish nobility began contemplating means by which to spur one another to political action. Thomas Lefroy, an ultra-Tory and MP for Dublin University, stressed in late 1830 the importance of organizing a Protestant body, force any government that might be to do justice to Irish Protestants and prevent their former privileges being now turned into disqualifications. Lefroy also laid out an important political strategy for conservatives to regain power, which highlighted the Anglo-Irish support in any future conservative government. Quote, in order to get rid of the Whigs, they, Irish conservatives, must come to an understanding with people. Whenever they assist his return to power, he must give up his former policy as to Ireland, making him pledge to do equal justice to Protestants and appoint men to govern them who will do so with fairness. By the end of the following year, he was writing to the ultra-Tory Lord Farnham, enthusiastic by the prospects of creating an organization to, quote, give direction and energy to the and unite them under those they are looking up to for guidance. The lead up to and passage of the Great Reform Act further galvanized ultra-Tory political mobilization in Ireland, many of whom interpreted the act not simply as a political question, but a religious and a moral one. Ultra-Tories like Lord Lorton, Roden, and Enniskillen organized the Irish Protestant Conservative Society in 1831, and with it a Protestant rent used to register conservative voters should the cost of shoulder the cost of campaigns and defend Protestants from the overbearing violence and exercising their right to vote and providing solicitors to challenge the voter rolls. Much as newspapers reported the weekly amounts raised in O'Connell's Catholic rents, some newspapers made note of the funding pouring into Irish Protestant Conservative Society's coffers, from 307 shillings and 4 pennies in August 1832 to £760 for the last week of September, before dropping back down to £256, 2 shillings and 3 pennies in mid-December. The Newcastle that the Reverend Charles Boynton, a fellow at Trinity College Dublin, had moved to transfer the funds to the Grand Orange Lodge, quote, to organize that body, which was so necessary to the existence of Protestantism in Ireland. For Boynton and other leaders in Ireland, the amount of money raised was almost of secondary importance to the Protestant union. As if Catholic emancipation was not enough, Daniel O'Connell's vocal campaign for the repeal of the Act of Union, which commenced in earnest in 1832, further threatened Irish Protestants. While ascendancy may have been lost when Catholics walked through the doors of Parliament as duly elected, Irish Protestants could console themselves with the knowledge that they still constituted a entirety of the United Kingdom. Repeal, of course, jeopardized their majority status, rendering them vulnerable to the domination they had exercised over their Catholic brethren. When Lord Roden wrote to the Duke of Wellington seeking his advice on how Roden should lead the, quote, million of people who are ready to sacrifice anything and everything, Wellington responded by pointing to the powerful unifying effect of the question of repeal brought to Protestants on both sides of the Irish Sea. The Protestants of Ireland, by taking up the case of the Union and of the connection with Great Britain, amalgamate themselves with that country. They take their true and real position in the affairs of the empire, and they derive great advantage from the course which they will have pursued, Wellington proposed to Roden. As O'Connell repeal and worked to grind parliamentary business to a halt, Wellington suggested that Irish Protestants would become more valuable to the British state in proportion to O'Connell's potential for success. Protestants may expect that they will be courted in proposition as apprehensions will be entertained of the persevering exertions of O'Connell and the Roman Catholics. Finally, and arguably most consequentially, for the remainder of the decade, Wellington suggested transforming the issue of repeal from a political into a religious question. Let the question of repeal or no repeal be a question of Protestant and Catholic, and you may rely upon it that the Protestant cause will be in this country. I therefore recommend you to make your rallying point no repeal of the Union. Of course, this was not the first suggestion by a British politician to transform an Irish political question into a religious one. Nevertheless, the transformation of Irish political issues into sectarian lightning rods became a potent strategy and powerful weapon for ultra-Tories throughout the latter half of the 1830s, ultimately bearing fruit in their electoral success in 1841. Political debate in London or in Dublin was often accompanied with unrest or violence across the Irish countryside, a fact which tended to contribute to Irish Protestant perceptions of being under siege by a hostile majority. It is easy with hindsight to look back on these fears of potential rebellion or the repeal of the Act of Union and to think they were irrational, disingenuous, preposterous, or some combination thereof. However, it seems worth keeping in mind how O'Connell's campaign for Catholic emancipation had fundamentally upset the Protestant world and how the means by which he did so ruptured social and political cohesion. Robert Peel observed in his memoirs that what was most terrifying about O'Connell's election in Clare was, quote, in the peaceable and legitimate exercise of a franchise, according to the will and conscience of the holder, because it was a revolution in the electoral system of Ireland, the transfer of political power. Thus, for the Protestant-led social order, O'Connell's victory demonstrated the end of their rule. Just want to make sure I have the quote up right. The fever of political and religious excitement, which was quickening the pulse and fluttering the bosom of the whole Catholic population, which had inspired the serf of Clare with the resolution and energy of a freeman, had in the twinkling of an eye made all consideration of personal gratitude, ancient family connection, local preferences, the fear of worldly injury, the hope of worldly advantage, subordinate to one absorbing sense of religious obligation and public duty. Peel's reference to the serf and the freeman is a telling one, as it denoted his perception of a transformation from a peasant population bound to their land and therefore to their landlord's interests into a political body with a will of its own. As O'Connell began to advocate repeal and elections were on the horizon, parts of the countryside responded with violence. In counties Meath, Roscommon, Clare, Mayo, Sligo, and Cavan, Dublin Castle received reports of the country in a quote-unquote very bad state, which necessitated the dispatch of movable columns of troops from Dublin. In Galway, the land agent of the Mann estate, Charles Filgate, complained of ribbonmen out every night, disturbing the population and amassing firearms. While ribbon activity certainly alarmed landlords, their clandestine activities suggested deeper foundational problems in the social order. Quote, I don't know what will come of us, all landlords, Filgate wrote to Sir Roszman in April 1831, if the government don't immediately send troops. A few days later, confessing to the Anglican parson, Reverend Rawdon Green, married to one of Mann's daughters, Filgate wrote, the times are such that I think the value of property here has fallen by a quarter, and I fear much worse times. Privately, it is the opinion of many of us to leave this country altogether, as no doubt the Reform Bill will pass, then the repeal of the Act of Union, which no government can prevent. You may say I cry out too soon, but I fear we shall soon see it. Filgate, of course, did cry out too soon, and repeal never materialized as the inevitable consequence of including Catholics in the nation's polity. But Filgate's private confession of a desire to emigrate was a real problem for Irish conservatives during the 1830s. Ultra-Tory grandees, including Enniskillen, Roden, Lorton, Farnham, along with the Duke of Cumberland, established the Protestant Colonization Society of Ireland in 1830, quote, a society for the preventing of Protestant emigration and pauperism and for promoting scriptural education and loyalty. In a replaying of the plantations of the 16th and 17th centuries in miniature with coded language implying the superiority of Protestant tenants over the Catholic majority, the society resettled Protestants onto unoccupied wastelands as a way to, quote, check the swelling torrent of emigration that is year after year draining out the moral and physical energies of that country and to turn back upon our native soil the streams of real wealth produced by honest enterprise of industrious men. By 1832, the Society had relocated Protestant tenants onto land in County Donegal and were actively seeking suitable land in Munster at the behest of Protestant interests in Cork, with financial support from subscriptions across the country and an influx of cash from the disbanded Brunswick clubs. The report, totaling roughly 40 pages, offers a window into the anxieties of Protestants across Ireland. In the report of their annual meeting held in May 1832, speakers highlighted what they perceived as the moral and economic peril of Protestant emigration, which they estimated had totaled roughly 77,000 Protestants the previous year. Contrasting the Protestant North, where all is quiet, all is peace, With the rest of Ireland, which had descended, quote, into the shades of rapine and assassination, Captain Cottingham argued that further immigration would drain the great mainstay of Protestant security from the land. While appealing to the Protestants of Ireland to support the Society's efforts, Cottingham also appealed to the British government by stressing the loyalty of Protestants and the short-sightedness of encouraging emigration to the North American colonies with British money. Drawing on experience of the American Revolution, Cottingham argued, this is the list of the Protestant Conservative Colonization Society and then the Protestant Society, which I'll talk about in a second. But I wanted to drop this quote. "Oh, how prophetic was the reasoning of Lord Bacon when he drew the comparison between the colonizing of our then American settlements and that of Ireland's. A few short years but passed away, and those very colonies, established by British wealth and peopled with Britain's sons, threw off the mother country and were to be found in arms against her. Who will be bold enough to say that such may not be the fate of our present Canadian and New Brunswick settlements? It becomes then a matter of sound policy on the part of England to promote our infant undertaking to keep within the realms of England's natural boundary here freeborn, brave, and spirited sons, the descendants of those gallant men who conquered Ireland, who have kept her as part and parcel of the British dominions, and who are ready to devote their lives and property in supporting British connection." Thus, the political and social atmosphere for Irish Protestants in the early 1830s was one of profound anxiety and frenzied reaction. The manner and means by which O'Connell had secured Catholic emancipation caused deep distress to those wishing to protect whatever waning influence Protestant ascendancy still had, and their response was to imitate O'Connell's tactics of uniting Protestants of differing economic and denominational backgrounds into societies with financial means and popular support. They also leaned on time-honored tropes of Protestant loyalty, Catholic treachery, and the substitution of political considerations for sectarian divisions. These appeals to anti-Catholicism and sectarianism would become increasingly influential and successful throughout the 1830s as conservative political mobilization grew and Ireland became the central focus in the campaign to cast off the Whigs' program of reform. Okay, so switching now to more about political mobilization. On the 20th of June, 1835, an alleged crowd of 5,000 took their seats at Exeter Hall in London for a great Protestant meeting. Here's an image of Exeter Hall, although this is about anti-slavery, I will say, but they used the same building often. So the crowd, which gathered many from the upper echelons of ultra-Toryism, had gathered to hear the theological arguments of the Reverend R.J. McPhee, Mortimer O'Sullivan, and Henry Cook concerning the quote-unquote real tenets of the Catholic Church in Ireland. Probably not a surprise to this audience, but the verdict was not positive. Using the book Den's Complete Body of Theology as their proof text, indicating the doctrine of the Catholic hierarchy in Ireland, McPhee, O'Sullivan, and Cook argued with, in the words of one newspaper, the floridity of coloring peculiar to Irish orators, that it was the object of Ireland's Catholic hierarchy, quote, to compel heretics, i.e. Protestants, by corporate punishment to return to their faith of popery through confiscation of property, exile, imprisonment, and death. So a little dramatic. Making comparisons between the state of Ireland and the volcanic effusions of Vesuvius, McPhee warned that the Catholic teaching in Dens demonstrated what would happen to Protestants if they did not meet the Catholic threats. Quote, "What peace can we expect in such a state of things as this, when confiscations, exile, imprisonment, and death, the very horrors of war, are incorporated in the very frame of man's social existence?" Referring to the violence of the quote-unquote deluded peasantry of Ireland, McPhee rhetorically asked who could blame their actions when, quote, the very crimes of the unhappy people are enumerated amongst the virtues of the authoritative standard of their spiritual guide. In short, Ireland stood on the brink of destruction because Catholicism seemed on the ascendancy, and that Catholicism was an existential threat to the Protestant nature of British rule in Ireland and, by extension, Great Britain and the wider empire. The Protestant Association acted as the connective tissue tying together the religious rhetoric of evangelical Protestantism and the political program of ultra-Toryism. Perceived Irish problems, both religious and political in nature, acted as a sort of centripetal force, pulling diverse strands together in common political purpose. Ultra-Tory grandees like Lord Roden, Enniskillen, Kenyon, Farnham, and Lorton patronized the Protestant Association and other organizations like it, with numerous Conservative MPs openly associated with the organization and occasionally publishing under its auspices. In an 1840 pamphlet penned by the Tory MP J.C. Calhoun and published by the Protestant Association, Calhoun argued that the primary focus of the association was to, quote, unite all who value the principles of our Constitution and disprove the falsities of liberalism that threaten to change time-honored institutions and plunge Ireland and consequently Britain into a state of anarchy. He continued, quote, the Protestant Association would employ the pulpits, the platform, the press, and parliamentary petitions to inculcate sound views. They'd use public meetings to excite interest, and by means of that interest, they would circulate their publications. By 1840, Calhoun could boast that the association had organized provincial meetings across cities in England and Scotland, had published at least 35 tracts and pamphlets, and had a monthly magazine called the Protestant Magazine to disseminate their arguments. Publications were sold cheaply, even cheaper in bulk, and were meant for wide circulation. Many publications were republished articles from Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, arguably the leading anti-Catholic ultra-Tory periodical in Britain, speeches of ultra-Tory MPs, or sermons that sold anywhere from 1 penny to 6 pennies, or multiple shillings for the 100. Titles included the rather mundane, like speeches of J.C. Calhoun upon the Maynooth College grant, to the deliberately provocative, like cruelties of popery, popery like paganism, popery the enemy of God and man. Titles often went through many editions and were printed in the tens of thousands. The association met annually and published reports of the proceedings, which generally featured speeches on the dangers of Catholicism and the threat it posed to the Protestant nature of the state. And then these would get picked up by newspapers, circulated across the British reading public, and also into Ireland. The Protestant Association and its numerous publications, along with the increasingly vocal Protestant press, spent the 6 years between 1835, when the Whigs returned to power, and 1841 to hammer the Whig government for their approach to governing Ireland. The ultra-Tory press made sure to mix surging Catholic political influence, Irish agrarian violence, sectarian paranoia, and political revolution into a strong cocktail for English and Irish audiences to imbibe. O'Connell's assumed, occasionally real, influence over Whig patronage and state bureaucracies unnerved Ireland's Protestant gentry, accustomed to the last vestiges of ascendancy extending over Dublin Castle. And the message from these ultra-Tories was that the writing was on the wall. Heed Ireland's experience or suffer the consequences. Although an imperial framework may not have been the primary lens by which commentators discussed Irish agrarian violence and Catholic ascendancy, it nevertheless became a feature in writings throughout the latter half of the 1830s, often as a stick to compel British Protestants to wake up to the dangers posed by Irish Catholicism. In The Progress of Popery in the British Dominions and Elsewhere, published in 1839, the author lamented the rising influence of Catholics since emancipation. Quote, many very high offices of state are now either held by Roman Catholics or persons of that class, the author complained, while stressing that in Ireland, quote, nearly every legal situation which has fallen vacant during the existence of the present government has been given to a Roman Catholic. Worse still, however, the author stressed that the government adopted this practice in their appointments across the colonies, such as in New South Wales, where Sir Maurice O'Connell is the newly appointed governor, whose very name speaks volumes. Subtly, the author concludes the pamphlet by worrying how Catholics were organizing in Britain, just as they had done in Ireland, through societies, many of them in secret, quote, for the purpose of overbearing the government by preparing to consummate their intrigues by intimidation. Thus, Irish violence also operated as a popular motif, connecting domestic anxieties into imperial frameworks. So, for example, beginning in 1837 and 1838, both the lower and upper provinces of Canada broke out into rebellion against the British. In Lower Canada, French Canadians, as well as lower class English-speaking Canadians, believed that British colonial administration was undemocratic, as their elected officials had no actual power because all political decisions could be vetoed by the Crown-appointed Governor-General. Furthermore, French speakers expressed economic discontentment, having been historically shut out from the lucrative sectors of the economy, such as banking and the timber industry. Led by the charismatic Louis-Joseph Pompignac, himself often compared to Daniel O'Connell in the press, and his trusted Cork-born Lieutenant Dr. Edmund Bailey O'Callaghan, the rebellion was put down by British troops in 1838 and 39. But as word of the rebellion in Lower Canada spread, the Times published a series of articles attempting to shape the narrative and indict Whig governance. On the 23rd of December, 1837, when, quote, little, if anything, was yet established with regard to the unfortunate state of Lower Canada, the Times writer began asking hypothetical questions about whether Times readers should consider it a just rebellion. Whereas the American Revolution should be understood as a justified rebellion due to the perverse and unreasoning ruler who enacted policies, quote, inconsistent with the habitual relations of the parent state and colony, the author was quick to point out that the rebellion of 1798 was, quote, not caused by any peculiar pressure of grievance or suffering, but was a manipulation by Irish leaders of, quote, general sense of destitution among Ireland's peasantry. The result of that manipulation was the attempt at the expulsion of the Protestant and British power out of Ireland in a false rebellion. The lesson readers should take, well, that if 3 to 4 million quote unquote Irish fanatics could be turned out in 1798 by quote systematic and artful organization, then the Canadian rebellion must now be crushed. Quote, it is very easy of belief, therefore, that the rebellion of Lower Canada may have been the exclusive workmanship of incendiaries directed by a few central chiefs, having for its materials a race of ignorant men, jealous and fearful of their British neighbors, and therefore actuated by an envenomed hatred of them, as the Irish are at all times, by a vague exasperation at the wretchedness of their own physical condition. Politicians and newspapers made the connection between the violence in Ireland and Canada explicit, as word of the rebellion in Upper Canada engrossed newspaper headlines. As the Whig government offered the reduction in Irish outrages as an example of the success of their political agenda of quote-unquote justice to Ireland, Anglo-Irish Tories offered a radically different picture of the Irish countryside. Under the headline, The Base, Bloody, and Brutal Whigs, the Kerry Evening Post, one of a number of conservative newspapers, tied the Whigs' relationship with O'Connell to their inability to prevent, quote, a civil war, bloody and brutal, in Canada, which they feared will spread desolation and blood over a fair portion of the domains of Britain, especially as it was clear, quote, the similarities of the movements in Ireland under the direction of Mr. O'Connell and those in Canada as regulated by the mastermind of the great colonial agitator, Pompignac. The role played by O'Connell and the priests in directing agrarian violence was also a constant obsession of the newspapers. As landlords like Lord Downshire complained to Sir Robert Peel that Ireland, quote, was as ripe for rebellion as it is possible and only the match is wanting, he pressed the Conservative leader to expose the falsity of Whig claims to tranquility. Quote, I think it is highly necessary to mention the dreadful state in which Ireland is at present, both as to past murders and outrages, and to those gentlemen who are marked out for future slaughter by this secret tribunal. Newspapers produced a litany of outrages under sarcastic headlines like, quote, the tranquility of the country, or O Mulgrave tranquility, highlighting the apparent disparity between the government rhetoric and Irish reality, as they listed murders, serious assaults, and other outrages county by county, underscoring whether possible sectarian dimensions of the violence may have occurred. Charles Fox, the recently defeated Conservative MP for Longford and cousin to the ultra-Tory Farnham family, wrote, quote, this Canada business ought to open our eyes and the eyes of everyone to the consequence of that policy which treats the enemies of the Constitution and British connection as men to whom every concession is to be made, till they take up arms. While the Nina Guardian mocked, quote, the Canadas may be in revolts, while the northern bear steals with stealthy pace towards our Indian possession, the British lion sleeping all the time. Oh, no matter. There's tranquility in Ireland. There is one smiling oasis in this great desert of ministerial incapacity. Working hand in hand with the rhetoric of dispelling the tranquility claims of the Whig government was the reference to the political system of ribbonism and the violence of ribbon men. By 1839, the ultra-Tory Lord Roden was arguing that ribbonmen found inspiration in the Canadian Rebellion, and in conjunction with O'Connell and the Catholic priests were planning a rebellion of their own. Roden was successful in establishing a parliamentary select committee to inquire into Irish outrages in 1839, which included testimony of magistrates, landlords, and constables. H.W. Rowan, a magistrate in County Westmeath, testified to the wide influence of Ribbonism, quote, as a political object to overturn the government of Ireland, and that from 1838, the activity of the organization had increased, quote, perhaps from the impulse given to it by the rebellion in Canada. Passwords were seized from alleged ribbonmen with codes like, I hope your Irish sons will gain their freedom. Ah, yes, when the Canadas conquer. Or, have you got any news? Ah, yes, we hear they are doing well in Canada. Major George Warburton, a long-standing stipendiary magistrate, testified to an organized plot in County Meath to post notices from Dublin to Derry, quote, calling upon the people to imitate the Friends of Liberty in Canada and to rise and shake off the yoke that had so long oppressed them. The arrest of alleged Ribbon Secretary Richard Jones and his subsequent trial in 1840 produced seemingly endless fodder for Tory newspapers to speculate on alleged connections between ribbonmen on the one hand, the Canadian Rebellion, and other possible colonial contexts. The Nenagh Guardian, sometimes cutting and pasting from the Dublin Evening Post, made hay of the revelations at Jones's trial. In particular, the interpretation that, quote, Ribbonism is a universal system acting upon one uniform principle, a political, seditious, and revolutionary system. Highlighting O'Connell's return to repeal agitation in 1839 and 40, the Guardian attempted to link Ribbon subterfuge with O'Connellite politics and by proxy to tarnish a politically weak Whig government that was still receiving life support from O'Connell's votes at Westminster. Quote, the political aspiration for Daniel's favorite project, the dismemberment of the British Empire, were directly inculcated on the ribbonmen. After alluding to the apparent affinity between ribbonmen and Canada, it was mentioned that Irish ribbonism, this is a quote, sorry, it was mentioned that Irish ribbonism had recognized and sympathized with the rebellion in Lower Canada. Oh, those loyal fellows are those O'Connellites. The article concludes by complaining how little attention other newspapers had paid to ribbonism's influence with Whig government and those quote-unquote Irish thugs associated with O'Connell. It is to this last appellation of Irish thugs that I want to now turn in the last 5 minutes that I have remaining. I'm just going to put these images up. Joseph Lennon and Luke Gibbons have both demonstrated ways in which the Orient and Orientalist discourses were prominent in 19th century literature, often as either an allegory for Irish writers to work out anti-colonial struggle, or in the words of Gibbons, as an internal struggle between constitutional nationalism and a dissident insurrectionary tradition. Anglo-Irish Tories also employed Orientalist discourse as a way to mark Catholic Ireland's political and social position as akin to the wild and untamed portions of India, and in need, therefore, of British discipline. Tory writers and newspapers, therefore, were quick to appropriate thuggee and to deploy it as a term to undermine the Whigs' argument of Irish tranquility. In January 1840, the Dublin University Magazine published an article by the Reverend Samuel O'Sullivan entitled Thuggee in India, Ribbonism in Ireland Compared. In it, O'Sullivan reviewed Captain Philip Meadows Taylor's best-selling novel, Confessions of a Thug, to the quote-unquote ribbon system witnessed around Ireland. As was rather common for a literary journal, O'Sullivan excerpted Taylor's novel at length, paying particular attention to the religious elements of the thug's initiation, where the protagonist, Amir Ali, placed his hand on the Quran and swore a fearful oath to, quote, pursue to destruction every human being thrown into thy power. Detailing Ali's first ritualistic murder and the accompanying religious service, O'Sullivan notes, quote, no devotee of the Romanish communion ever worshipped their patron saint with more devotion than the thugs exhibited towards their goddess. After a good bit of sermonizing on the universal depravity of humanity and the powerful benefits of quote-unquote true religion, O'Sullivan reaches his purpose, the comparison between thugs in India and ribbonmen in Ireland. Quote, What is Ribbonism but a species of political thuggee in which the conspirators are of one religion and bind themselves by an oath of blood to the extermination of all whom opposition to their evil designs might be apprehended? He continues, the system of Irish thuggee is political as well as religious. It is by acting upon the temporal power that it is enabled to accomplish its ecclesiastical objects. The party, and here in particular he was referring to the Whig party, the party in power have sold themselves to work the will of the great agitator, to whom the Irish thugs look up as their Magnus Apollo. Whereas in India, both Tory and Whig agreed on the depravity of thug violence and the need to root it out, O'Sullivan argued that the Whigs effectively propagated a narrative that turned a blind eye on ribbon violence and O'Connell's involvement in its orchestration, despite its dangers to, quote, the integrity of the empire. So in conclusion, whether focused on the apparent analogous relationship between French Catholic rebels in Lower Canada and Ireland's peasantry, or the similar practices of Indian thugs and Irish ribbonmen, Tory commentators and politicians found reasons to cast their eyes abroad, to emphasize the grave risk that would be posed to the British Empire if the Whigs were allowed to continue their program of reform at home. Dwelling on the alleged political aspirations of the Catholic Church underscored the potential disloyalty of Catholics domestically. Many ultra-Tories, and even some more moderate conservatives, believed the Catholic hierarchy did not view emancipation as some sort of final settlement, but as a decisive step towards the complete undermining of the Protestant establishment, and as a result, the British characteristics of liberty and freedom. What is more, the Catholic Church, or Daniel O'Connell's role in establishing a new order, was the problem to which Tory commentators habitually returned. Agrarian violence was not spasmodic, episodic, or unintelligible. Rather, outrages were a means to establish, quote, a reign of terrorism in Ireland to paralyze the government and to undermine the integrity of the British Empire. The dysfunction of the Irish countryside shone brightest in the political sky at the time and operated as a point by means of which Tory commentators and politicians could chart their course back to government benches. Thanks.
Jerry, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I get a great advertisement for the book, which I'm certainly looking forward to reading when I get my hands on it. So we've got time now for questions. So obviously we have an audience here in the room, so you know how to indicate if you want to ask a question. So those joining us online through Teams, you should see on your screen a button that says reactions. And then if you click on that, there's a little hand icon. So if you click on that, that will just indicate that you want to ask a question, and I'll invite you to pose it. So let's open it up to the floor. Who'd like to start in?
I'm going to ask a question you invited us to ask. Could you say a bit more about the taxonomy?
Sure. So I don't know if this will, I'll go way back. So effectively, oh, maybe it's not going to let me go back. Effectively, what the British state does is they they create a set of what they call outrages in particular categories. And it spans kind of four different large buckets, so to speak. So offenses against the person, offenses against property, offenses affecting the public peace, and then a kind of catch-all that was other offenses. And it's a messy business, by which I mean, I think I, at least speaking for myself, want to impose, they're trying to impose order on something that is disordered, so they're trying to read into every act of any potential violence some sort of underlying cause that made it subversive. And many times, you know, in reading these outrage reports, there's nothing in it. It's like classic David Fitzpatrick stuff that he's written about, the fact that this is intercommunal or interfamily violence that's playing out. But for a small subset of the violence, it is clear that there's something else going on that, regardless of how much Irish farmers really understood this, the British state thought it was a significant problem and that it threatened basically law and order and the establishment of legal norms. So these forms then get produced from 1837 on with fits and starts, where they basically count how many outrages happened, and they can look at, like, okay, in January 1839, there was 212 assaults. Well, that's down from, say, 350 assaults this time last year. So we can say that what we're doing is working. Tories would then say, well, yeah, assaults may be down, but 5 more people were killed in this month. So obviously, there's something else going on. So there was a way to kind of manipulate the data in all sorts of different ways that suited anybody's political kind of interest. But these statistics, I think, the way that the state wanted it, at least the Whigs wanted it to be, was the scientific sort of explanation of what's happening. And the reality is that statistics get used in all sorts of different political ways.
I mean, by gathering it in that way and giving it that freedom of reading that kind of taxonomy, doesn't that actually produce a narrative that goes on, which is that all of this is much more concerted across the country than the random family. This way, you actually say this is concerted set of activities, not just random.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So two things about that. One, I'm having flashbacks of conversations with my dissertation advisor, who's since passed away, where we joked about ordinary, decent criminals and the state thinking about them versus the way they think about agrarian violence or outrages. So there is that going on. The Irish government had different statistics for your fight outside of a pub or your petty larcenies. That was separate from, that was not special, and that's literally what they called it. It was ordinary criminal violence that they kept away from these outrage reports. So that's the first thing. I suppose the second thing to say is I agree. It absolutely was a way for them to create a narrative. What that narrative entailed, I think, is up for debate. Because the flip side is, at least from the Whigs' point of view, from the really from 1798 or even earlier, what they're getting is, unregularized reports from magistrates and land agents saying, like, the sky is falling, all hell is breaking loose. And then when Dublin Castle investigates, they realize that's not what's happening, right? So I think for them, the standardization was a way to scientifically tell what's happening in the countryside so that they can suppress it and control it effectively.
Okay, I'm going to go to Guy online first, then I'll come to Constantine. So Guy, over to you.
Can you hear me there?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, brilliant. Jay, first of all, praise for the book. It really is great to see it. When we had a conversation years back and you were telling me what the project is about, it was just great to read the book afterwards. And I also, well done for bringing into the debate the outrage reports, because we've all looked at the outrage papers, but the reports allow you to make these see these wider patterns. And really, that has to be, the novelty of that has to be acknowledged, and that's great. You raised I have a lot of questions. I'm going to choose one because it made me think about a lot of things. But first of all, a quick comment. I think it'll be interesting, especially in light of your looking at Canada and then looking at India and looking at all this discourse. I think it'll be really interesting to look at this in light of rereading Hobsbawm's Primitive Rebels and Social Banditry, because he's the one person who tried to kind of make a theory of what we treat all these people. And he had a very Marxist kind of approach, right? His whole approach was, these are primitive rebels. They don't have ideology yet. And this will lead me to the kind of question I wanted to ask you. How are you placing this within a larger tradition? I mean, you've referenced it here and there. It's clear what you're really looking at here. Let's be clear about this, is about the political framing of Irish agrarian violence. But this political framing is an ongoing thing. You could say it's continued, through the 19th, 18th, 19th, into the 20th century. Right? How do you frame, is it political violence? Is it non-political violence? Is it inchoate? Is it organized? You seem to suggest that the Tory reading, and not just the Tory, the British reading of this, is that it does amount to, or at least in your interpretation, to a challenge to sovereignty. You're saying there's two systems of law. You put these different points and they're kind of pointing to this all the time. But of course, we've been through this before, right? We've been through this before in 1798. We've been through this before in white boyism. Then you refer to ribbonism, and this continues again and again. So how does this fit within this tradition? And I was curious within that, because we were often told in relation to 1798 that Musgrave is a canonical text, that is the text that shaped British conservative memory, the ultra kind of conservative memory leans on Musgrave. Musgrave seeing 1798 as a Jacquerie, right? But interestingly enough, I didn't see in the book any references to Musgrave. So I'm wondering, I mean, how do these memories play in? So a comment perhaps on the wider thing and how it plays with previous memories.
Lots there. Thanks so much, Guy, and thanks for your praise is very kind and humbling. So I do think that the British state is putting this into the reason why they're so concerned, the reason why they're spending all this manpower and this time in surveilling agrarian violence is because they read into it something that is political in its nature. It is at one point, I can't remember what magistrate said this, but it's a lawless spirit of law giving. So the idea being that there's this disorder, it's breaking with British law and order, but it's a law all of its own. So in some ways, obviously, that's E.P. Thompson, at least, this idea of a kind of a moral economy at the lower echelons of society. I don't think that that's true. If you look at all of the agrarian violence, it's not all of that. It is the domestic, it's the tawdry, it's the random things that happen. It's the sheep stealing that has nothing to do with bigger political stories. But the fact that the state is worried about it is what I'm interested in, and arguing that that's why it matters or it has meaning. I take your point about Musgrave. You're right. He's not mentioned at all in the book. And to be honest, thinking about, I would need to go back to the sources to think about how 1798 in particular is articulated by some of these ultra-Tories. I mean, there's a lot of what I was really interested in is all the religious discourse, which obviously fits into the Second Reformation in the 1820s and 1830s, and evangelizing or this evangelical kind of rhetoric. But I'm less, in my mind, trying to think back about political ideology and thinking about this memory of 1798 and what it symbolized that picks up on that theme. So that's something for me to consider in the future, for sure.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go to Constantine next.
Yeah, I think the conversation is very interesting because I'm taking a different angle on that same area. I've just begun a PhD researching agrarian secret societies in a bit of a longer term development from 1840 to 1880. So my question would have two parts. The first being, you say that this agrarian outreach are over-reported and the authorities read into it. Which I think there's no argument on the more serious grievances, like they were read into murders. But Anne Coleman has made the point, which I found very convincing, that the less serious grievances, like threatening notices, offenses against property, were actually underreported. And she has substantiated that claim with reference to the Stewart and Kincaid papers. There was a big land agency in the 1840s, which I have not seen yet, but from what she writes about it, it seems very convincing. So regarding your other point of the authorities reading into that, given this argument that some stuff was clearly overreported and to other stuff may have gone underreported, my question would be, what is your idea of what they are reading into it and why? So do they actually genuinely believe that this is bigger than it might actually be, or is there some level of intentional propagandistic distortion going on of this agrarian violence?
Well, I would say that I think for everybody, they're using it. Both sides are using it for their own kind of political purposes. So there's definitely propaganda going on. I'm writing down to myself I keep coming. I've yet to work this out, so this is going to be a terrible answer. But I keep coming back to property, private property being an organizing principle that the British state is particularly worried about defending, and that obviously agrarian violence undermines, because access to land is about, obviously is about survival, but it oftentimes is undermining these ideas around what property holders can do with their private property. So threatening notices, I've not read this, so thank you very much for the reference. Threatening notices are interesting because I'm thinking about the times where it really matters most are when they're threatening Anglican parsons about tithes, of course, so that has to do with property, or when they're threatening property holders with either people taking up land from evicted tenants, or like there's cases of combinations, so the community banding together to do something. So that's where I feel like there's this worry about private property regimes that's different than the political story of like, oh, we're worried about an Irish nation, or the like. I mean, with O'Connell, I think at times that is important, but I don't think that that's the story. I think it's much more about property norms, about classic law and order sort of things that it seems like the Irish peasantry largely, a terrible term as well, but that's what I'm using. That they're challenging those norms that the British are trying to impose. Yeah.
I think that this is largely very convincing, but I think that there might be an element to it of even of the state being worried about some level of conflux of these two elements, like the threat against the property regime and Irish nationalism. Because from my initial look at the sources, particularly regarding the Molly Maguires, which is slightly later in the period, would indicate that there is some level of very disjunct, of course, and sporadic, the fusion of labor-related grievances and nationalist rhetoric, and I think that might be a point that they're very worried about, even if it doesn't really materialize on a large scale. But it has to be alarming from that state perspective. So, would you, if you were to revise, would you factor that in?
No, I'm not, just to say, like in the book, hopefully I make this point that I don't think that most agrarian violence is political in its nature. I try to kind of sidestep the Garvin, all that kind of stuff about, what this violence meant as far as for Irish people. I'm instead suggesting that the state sees it as subversive and dangerous, and therefore something to attack, I suppose.
Okay, I'm going to go to Patrick online and then come back to the room. So Patrick, over to you first.
Thank you. Just I have two, I suppose, slightly connected questions. First of all, the Protestant Conservative Society. Is there any evidence there were local branches of that along the lines of the Liberal clubs, O'Connell's Liberal or Independent clubs? I think I came across a Protestant meeting in Cavan. I can't remember the exact year. Might have been 33 or 34. The impression I get it was led from the elites as opposed to working class Protestants, but what would your view be on that? And then also when you referenced, had the one reference to the contrast between the peaceful North and the tranquil North, and I suppose I can't remember what adjective it was, but the unpeaceful or the violent South. Was that a once-off, or is there any rhetoric even in comparing the ribbonmen with the Indians, as you mentioned towards the end of the presentation? Is there any territorial, or is there any distinction between North and South in any of that rhetoric?
Okay, so question number one. Sorry, I'm just trying to write down both so I don't forget them. I went really early on when I moved here to Tullynally Castle and got to look at some papers there. And one of the things I found was basically this. It was like a fill-in-the-blank pamphlet for the Protestant Conservative Society, where it was almost like a pre-written press release where you could put in your local branch in the blanks and then send that off and organize it. So there is elements of, I think, a kind of a cookie cutter approach to how that society works. That was one document I found in the archive. So how broad it is, I'm not really sure. I suppose the answer would be to troll, some of the provincial newspapers, the conservative newspapers, and see what kind of mentions you get in the 1830s. But that's a really good question that I'm not 100% sure of. There's definitely a distinction in the rhetoric between the North and the South. I mean, if it's Protestants, wanting to talk about how terrible agrarian violence is, it tends to be that things are relatively quiet in in the north, notwithstanding parts of Armagh in particular as being problematic in the Linen Triangle. But nevertheless, that there is this coded language about industrious people and the north being much more peaceful than the remainder of, like Tipperary in particular is the county that is picked out in the 1838, 1839 for all of its violence and its outrages. So,
Sean.
Thank you.
That was a really vivid account of the way the ultra-Tories use Ireland as a stick to make a Whig. But I did wonder, are you overstating the degree of polarization? The image you're getting is there's O'Connell, the militant followers, and there's the ultra-Tories, and the poor old reforming Whigs come in the middle. But I mean, 2 points. Number one, if you look at what's actually happening in Ireland in the mid-1830s, I mean, O'Connell's own repeal party, a substantial proportion, I can't remember the figure, a substantial proportion are actually Protestant. These are not Catholic MPs. And Alderman MacDonald made the point years ago, we're looking at the elections of the mid-1830s. What O'Connell is really doing is creating an anti-Tory alliance. He might only have 35 seats or so, but about 70 of the seats are held either by repealers or liberals. And he's mobilizing a substantial body of Catholic opinion and liberal Protestant opinion to create an anti-Tory alliance. And secondly, 1841, okay, you talk about ultra-Tories, but 1841 does not bring the Tories to power.
no, it does not.
I mean, Peel wants to push the repeal legislation. That's priority. Once he's done that on top, you're back to the politics of reform. The Charter of the Quest site, the Queen's Colleges, a renewed drive to find suitably qualified Catholics who can make magistrates and judges and so on. A very explicit attempt to detach the Catholic clergy and the Catholic middle classes from the Peel movement. So, you know, as I say, it's not simply the ultra-Tories and the O'Connellites. There are other things going on there which make the politics of reform much more credible.
Yeah, so I'll take the second point. I take both your points. My argument, the argument in the book, effectively is the ultra-Tories in 1830 are a politically defeated party or wing of a party that then have a breath of fresh air between 35 and 40 because of O'Connell's position, basically propping up the Whigs. And they use that to their advantage to make Ireland it's not the central tenant, but it is a central place where you can basically say that Whig governance is failing. And it is so successful that Lord Morpeth loses his seat in 1841 in Yorkshire. And, you know, looking at the kind of newspaper coverage of the, I can't remember what the newspaper is up there, the Leeds Advertiser or something, they make Morpeth's relationship with O'Connell central in that campaign. In 1841, Peel, and I have some ephemeral stuff about songs about Peel defeating, you know, Dan and, you know, all these songs and stuff about that. 1841, the Tories win the largest electoral victory that they're going to win until 1886 on another Irish question. And my argument basically is that then the ultra-Tories are jilted again, right? They're not needed. So you don't need to rely on ultra-Tories. So as a result, you kind of have this weird muddled Irish policy in the 1840s. De Grey is certainly, in my opinion, quite a conservative, not quite an ultra-Tory, but quite a conservative Lord Lieutenant. So in that sense, there is this kind of weird middle ground. But Peel, you're right, he veers away. And as a result, Roden and others feel jilted. So that's, you know, that would be kind of my argument about that. I also agree that there's tons of other things happening in the 1830s. And I think the big thing for me in this book or this project that I was coming to terms with is the fact that in 1835, the Whigs in power were different than the Whigs in the earlier part of the 1830s, and that the relationship with O'Connell, I think, actually was much more genuine than I think some historians have given credit to. And you're right, around certain things, O'Connell basically had to make a choice. Am I going to choose the Whigs or am I going to choose principle? And he angered lots of English radicals around things like the Canadian Rebellion, where he voted against English radicals and voted to prop up the Whig government because he thought his toast was better buttered by the Whigs than it would be by bringing Peel back in. And it was only in 1840-41 where he thought that Ireland would basically become ungovernable if Peel came back, and that would suit him for a future alliance with the Whigs again. But no, I take your points, and I do probably make things a little too stark.
James.
I'm just curious, were there any sort of discernible differences in approach to these issues from Peel prior to the election of 1841, or is that only just sort of come out when he's in power?
The problem with Robert Peel is he wrote far too many things, and there's too many letters. So I've gone through a lot of his correspondence, and my reading of him in the later 1830s is he is perfectly open to entertain Tories. I mean, he's getting letters from Frederick Shaw, is that his name?
Mm-hmm.
So he's getting letters from Frederick Shaw, one of the leaders in the House of Commons of kind of the Irish ultra-Tory wing. Reverend McPhee is writing him about all of his religious tracts. That's all in Peel's correspondence about how we need to be very careful of popery and its dangers. So Peel's entertaining these notions, and in 1839 he has when he almost comes to power around the bedchamber crisis, he has his cabinet set out, and we see some of his appointments, and it's not overly flavor, but again, there is a courting of Protestant opinion. So I think he definitely felt like it was necessary, but his election in 1841, or the Tories or Conservatives' vindication in 1841, kind of freed him from some of those challenges. And then his correspondence in 1841, 42, and 43, he's attacking de Grey a lot for his very conservative appointments, law appointments in particular, and saying that he's angering the Catholic community and people that the state wants to work with. And this creates a division between Peel on the one hand and de Grey on the other. And so you get kind of this division between Dublin Castle and Whitehall, effectively. Yeah.
Enjoy them. I'm particularly interested in Roden, I suppose.
Ah, yes.
He and the ultra-Tories are taking a very proactive form of opposition to the Whigs, not only in Parliament, but outside, when great Protestant meetings, using the press. Does that, Wellington and Peel aren't really on a proactive approach to opposition. So is there any sort of expression of reservations about that approach that they're taking and about attacking what Whig misconduct? The second sort of question that I have is many of the authors have close connections to the Orange Order. Roden, Kenyon, Barnum, all members. The Grand Lodge, of course, has dissolved by the time of 1836, I suppose. But is this something that the Whigs, O'Connellites, radicals use sort of to beat the Tories? Conversely to what the Tories are doing to the Whigs. So it'd just be interesting to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, those are two really great questions. So I talk a little bit in the book about how the Whigs organize, and O'Connell organize around the Orange Order question, and Hume and O'Connell. I can't say I remember distinctly the Orange Order really being mentioned in the later 1830s, though if it is, it would be about fear of going backwards in time, effectively, that the worry that the Tories might organize again in this in some sort of way that would be dangerous to, in particular, O'Connell's political machinations. The question about Peel and Wellington and Roden and their divisions is one that I think I have not thought. I was not as critical as I probably should be in the book and thinking about this, or there's more nuance probably there. So Roden writes a ton to Wellington. So having gone to Southampton and read, again, some of Wellington's correspondence, there's numerous letters from Roden. And Wellington seems to be on board with some of Roden's activity, but he is caught off guard in 1839 when Roden proposes this select committee that passes, I think, by 4 votes and barely anybody's there. He doesn't tell Wellington he's going to do it, but Wellington speaks in favor of it in the House of Lords. And so as a result, it passes. So I think there is probably more tension there than I really do justice to in the book. But having said that, I also think that there is a level of Wellington being quite happy with stoking some of these anti-Catholic, anti-Irish concerns for political ends that they can exploit and use for their own kind of electoral advantages. But so I'm sure there's more there. I'm also thinking about the fact that like Roden employs an agent, I think in 1839 to go around and take stories about what's happening in the Irish countryside so he can expose it to this committee. And you're smiling knowingly. So you've of course had to read all this awful microfilm, which is terrible. But we can talk later about that because I'd be really interested in your projects. Yeah.
I've got a question online, so I'm just going to go there first. And so Rowan, over to you.
Hello. Thank you so much for a great talk. And actually, I've been lucky enough to get to read your recent book. And I was wondering about kind of a thing that you've actually just said. And I'm interested in the book, you discuss the rhetoric used by the ultra-Tories as often anti-Catholic / anti-Irish and kind of lumping those two together. And I'm interested if that kind of points to a general slippage in their rhetoric. Is that a slippage that you are involved in? And does that point to a idea of proto-nationalist sentiment that the British are perceiving by the Irish actors? And I suppose also distinguishing between the ascendancy, whatever remnants of it there were, and the broader population.
That's a really perceptive question. I feel caught out in some ways. I hate that slash. I think the problem for me as a writer was how to communicate the vitriol, and it is spiritual oftentimes, and the rhetoric is or religious, I suppose is a better word for it, is religious in its formulation, but there is clearly, as I've mentioned before, there are clearly at times divisions between South and North, that Protestant and Catholic that then also have geographical backgrounds. So it's just not it's a messy term. So if anything, it's definitely not something that the historical actors use. It's the product of me not being able to figure out my categories and how to really write about it as critically as I probably should have. Having said that, I think it also kind of underscores the messiness of the period and how these religious identities get mapped onto quote unquote ethnic identities that is also complicated. I mean, obviously, ultra-Tories aren't writing, well, Anglo-Irish ultra-Tories aren't necessarily writing about anti-Irish sentiment. They see themselves as Irish. They see themselves as the leader of Irish society that have been dispossessed as the ascendancy. So like there's a lot going on there. But from British perceptions, there are ways in which the Irish are castigated that doesn't necessarily have to do with religion per se. That's a really good question.
Thank you. Yeah, Constantine.
Because you have described this phenomenon of like the ultra-Tories and in coalition with the Orange to some extent attempting to copy O'Connell's strategy and creating a political movement that transcends social and class boundaries. How successful was that? Like, on what ground did that fall with the Protestant population in Ireland? Because some things that I have found for that period would indicate that there are some Protestant communities, particularly in the south of Ulster, that are engaged as actors all in agrarian
Oh, yeah.
violence. So you have Protestants on both sides of
Mhm.
this phenomenon. So that would be very interesting if you have anything on that, like how the response differed, maybe regionally, maybe regarding social class or anything like that.
Yeah, again, so I was much more interested in kind of elite rhetoric, and I then kind of segregated much of the activity of outrages to one particular chapter. I mean, that your question makes me think of that great article by Alan Blackstock, however long ago, Tommy Downshire Boys in Past and Present, and the ways in which oftentimes class could supplant sectarian dimensions. So I think that that absolutely is true. That and depending, and that Tommy Downshire Boys happens, I think, right in the 1830s too, or 1820 to 1840 something. So yeah, absolutely. There is. I'm not sure how successful the political organizing really was for these on the ground for these organizations, and in fact, they were all at once very concerned about. They called it the Protestant rent, and yet at the same time, they were very concerned about not wanting to copy O'Connell, even though O'Connell had obviously laid out the groundwork for what political mobilization or popular mobilization looked like in the period. So there was a sense at which they were emulating while at the same time not wanting to admit that their program was unsuccessful, but looking very much like O'Connell. Yeah.
So we're running short on time, so I might just take the chair's privilege to ask the last question. That's
gosh.
okay.
Yeah, okay.
So what I'm kind of interested in this moment of transition, because in the way that the ultra-Tories regard the Whigs, right? So we go back to Catholic Emancipation, 1829. Ultra-Tories are preoccupied with the betrayal of their own leaders, of Peel and Wellington, and the selling out of the Constitution. Obviously, that antagonism is shifted to the Whig leadership by the later 1830s, and you have the Litchfield House Compact. I suppose is a kind of natural break there. But I'm wondering how important the Church Temporalities Act of 1833 is in transforming ultra-Tory attitudes, because I mean, you mentioned it before, the attack on the economic rights, privileges, and incomes of the Church of Ireland with the tithe war is a much more real attack on the Protestant ascendancy, if you like, than the symbolic attack of Catholic emancipation. And the Whigs, having previously repressed or used repression against that movement in 1833, appear to reward it by giving massive concessions to Catholic demands in terms of the cutting of the incomes of the Protestant diocese, the amalgamation of dioceses, and numerous other things that point forward towards further reforms to come on tithes. So is there a kind of significant ultra-Tory backlash at that point, which kind of shifts, if you like, the political balance of their preoccupations?
So yeah, the timeline, that's a great question. I would have to go back and think about the timeline of 1833 in particular. I mean, what I think about and talk a little bit about in the book is the fact that the appropriation clause becomes so important in 1834, and then upsets the political balance of power in the Whigs, leaving the Derby Dilly or whatever it's called. So Stanley and others who leave the party and go to the Conservatives. And as a result, what you have is Lord John Russell, who is saying, I'm going to appropriate the funds of the church and use those funds for other, for education, for other activities. And that certainly is a rallying point where ultra-Tories see that as a huge threat on the, the stability of the Protestant church in Ireland, and as, again, kind of a piece of this larger kind of movement that's happening that they want to stop and that they're quite worried about in Ireland. But 1833, that's interesting. I think of 1833 from the other side, which is that this is a moment for O'Connell of feeling very frustrated with politics, because it's the period where the Coercion Act is also passed, and where I think O'Connell feels like he's been betrayed by people that he maybe could potentially work with on a variety of different issues that he realizes he hates Stanley and he can't do that. No, so that's an excellent question I should come back to thinking about.
Great. Thank you very much, Jay. It's a really
Thanks, everybody. Thanks
really
to
wonderful
everybody online as well.
exchange.
Appreciate it.
Great presentation and fantastic Q&A session. So just a reminder for those of you who haven't had the chance to look at the book so far. So it's called Outrage in the Age of Reform, Irish Agrarian Violence, Imperial Insecurity and British Governing Policy 1830 to 1845. It's just out with Cambridge University Press. So
You'll only have to mortgage your first house maybe to buy it. But nevertheless, it's there for you.
In all good libraries.
Yeah, right.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone, whether you're joining us online or in person. Good afternoon, and let's give the Jay a round of applause.
Thanks.
Excellent, excellent. So.